the summer of 1971, there was no prison. There was only a university building, a psychology department, a basement. The experiment was simple. Volunteers would be recruited. Roles would be assigned. Some would become guards, others prisoners. No one was selected because they were violent. No one was unstable. Psychological screenings ruled that out. They were ordinary young men, students, polite, intelligent. The basement was transformed. Doors were reinforced. Cells were marked. Hallways narrowed. A schedule was posted. Cameras were installed. Microphones tested. Clipboards prepared. Everything was documented. There were no weapons, no physical restraints, no real authority. Only rules, written on paper. The volunteers were paid $15 a day, enough to seem harmless. They were told they could leave at any time. They believed it. The experiment was scheduled to last 2 weeks. No one expected trouble. No one expected harm. On the first day, nothing happened. The guards put on uniforms. The prisoners were given numbers. Names were removed. Everything still felt unreal. It looked like a game. It felt temporary, controlled, safe. The experiment had not yet begun.
The volunteers did not arrive as guards or prisoners. They arrived as students. Young men from the same city, the same age, the same classrooms. They answered a small newspaper advertisement. A study, 2 weeks, $15 a day. Nothing in the description mentioned power. Nothing mentioned humiliation. Nothing mentioned fear. Before the experiment, each volunteer was interviewed, tested, evaluated. Anyone with a history of mental illness was excluded. What remained were ordinary personalities, balanced, social, no signs of aggression. There was no selection for dominance, no preference for obedience. The assignment was random. A coin flip decided everything. Half became guards, half became prisoners. Not because of who they were, but because of chance. At first, everyone laughed. The uniforms felt like costumes. The roles felt temporary. The guards were told only one thing: maintain order. They were given no instructions on how to do it. The prisoners were told they had rights. They were told this was only an experiment. They were told they could leave. Everyone believed the same assumption, that identity would remain intact. No one imagined that a role, assigned casually, could begin to feel real. The volunteers did not change immediately. The environment did. And slowly, almost politely, the experiment moved forward. The change did not happen at once. There was no announcement, no instruction. No moment anyone could point to later and say, that's when it began. The guards were given uniforms, khaki shirts, mirrored sunglasses, wooden batons, not to be used as weapons, but as symbols. They were told to maintain order, nothing more. No rules on how far was too far. On the first night, the guards tested limits, not with violence, with tone, with posture, with distance. They woke the prisoners for head counts, again and again. Orders were repeated until mistakes were made. Mistakes were corrected publicly. Push-ups were assigned, postures enforced, laughter followed. It was framed as discipline, as structure, as necessary. Soon the rules multiplied. Stand here, look down, speak only when addressed. The prisoners began to comply, not because they agreed, but because resistance required energy they no longer had. The guards did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as doing their job. The sunglasses mattered. They hid the eyes. They removed feedback. They made reactions invisible. Without eye contact, empathy weakened. Without names, individuals blurred. Some guards went further. They invented punishments. They humiliated. They laughed. Others said nothing. Silence became agreement. The prisoners stopped referring to themselves by name. They used numbers. They asked permission for basic actions. They stood when spoken to. What was happening was not planned. It was emerging. Power does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with structure and the freedom to interpret it. By the end of the second day, the guards were no longer pretending.
The first breakdown did not look dramatic. There was no violence, no shouting, just breathing too fast. One prisoner began to panic. His thoughts raced, his words tangled. He asked to leave. The guards hesitated. This was unexpected. There was no rule for what to do next. So they waited, and the waiting made things worse. Crying followed, shaking, disorientation. The experiment, designed to observe, continued to observe. The prisoner was released, not because the system failed, but because the subject could no longer function within it. Others watched this happen. They learned what collapse looked like and what it cost. Soon the environment intensified. Sleep was interrupted. Meals were delayed. Privileges were removed. The guards framed it as control, as discipline, as necessary to maintain order. The prisoners experienced it differently, as unpredictability, as humiliation, as fear. Another prisoner stopped speaking. He stared at the wall, long after questions were asked. A third began screaming, not at the guards, but at the situation itself. The guards responded with rules, more structure, more punishments, believing that firmness would restore control. It did not. The prisoners no longer spoke of the experiment. They spoke of survival. At this point, the roles had fully replaced identity. Guards felt responsible for enforcing the system. Prisoners felt trapped inside it. No one asked whether the experiment should stop. The question was no longer visible. The breakdowns were not interruptions. They were the result. The experiment did not end because it was complete. It ended because someone finally looked at it from the outside. By the sixth day, the basement no longer resembled a study. It resembled a functioning institution. The guards were enforcing rules that had never been written. The prisoners were obeying without being told why. No one questioned the structure anymore. It felt permanent, normal. The researchers continued observing, taking notes, recording behavior, interpreting suffering as data. The experiment might have continued for the full 2 weeks. It might have gone further.
It stopped because one person refused to accept what she was seeing. She was not a guard, not a prisoner. She was an observer, someone not absorbed by the roles. She asked a simple question: "What are you doing to these people?" The question had not been asked before, not because it was complex, but because the system made it invisible. The experiment was terminated the same day, not gradually, not carefully, immediately. The guards removed their uniforms. The prisoners were told their names again. The basement returned to being just a basement. In the aftermath, many guards were disturbed by what they had done. Many prisoners were shaken by how quickly they had surrendered themselves. No one was physically forced. No one was threatened with real punishment. The power came from acceptance. The experiment became famous. It was taught in textbooks, summarized in lectures, often reduced to a lesson about authority. But the real lesson was smaller and more dangerous. That ordinary people in ordinary settings can become agents of cruelty without noticing the moment it happens. The Stanford Prison Experiment did not reveal who we are under extreme conditions. It revealed how little pressure it takes, and who will ask the question before it's too late.